Prejudice, as stated in the Oxford Dictionary of English, is defined as a preconceived opinion that is not based on a reason or actual experience. In the novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, many aspects of prejudice are explored, seen through the characters of the Macon community. Two areas of prejudice that Harper Lee examines are racial prejudice and gender prejudice. Racial prejudice in the most obvious form of prejudice within the novel. An example of racial prejudice is revealed to Scout when she is teased because her father, Atticus, is defending Tom Robinson in the court case. Scout is confused as to what the term nigger lover means, so she asks her father about it. Scout, said Atticus, nigger lover is just one of those terms that don't mean anything, like snot nose. So you aren't really a nigger lover then, are you? She asked him. I certainly am. I do my best to love everybody. When Scout confronts her classmate Cecil Jacobs in the schoolyard the next day about him calling her daddy a nigger lover, he yells at her and says, "My folks said your daddy was a disgrace, and that nigger ought to hang from the water tank." Harper Lee uses emotive language and imagery through the words of Cecil to make the reader feel the extreme views held by his family. The reader gets a vivid and disturbing visual image of a man hanging by a rope that is tied to a water tank. Scout wants to fight Cecil but holds back the urge because of her father's instructions and instead walks away to the shouts of "coward" echoing behind her. The children in this situation reflect the attitudes of their parents. Cecil reflects the deeply held prejudiced views of his family, which are commonly held opinions in the community, whereas Scout reflects the attitudes of her father, who is speaking up and speaking out against racial prejudice. An example from history when people have spoken up and spoken out against racial prejudice was in the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. When the athletes who placed first, second and third in the 200-metre race came to the podium to receive their medals, they wore black armbands. The two US athletes received their medals shoeless, but wearing black socks to represent black poverty. One wore a black scarf around his neck to represent the black pride, and the other wore a necklace of beads, which he described were for those individuals that were lynched or killed and that no one said a prayer for. They were hung or tarred. Another example of prejudice in To Kill a Mockingbird is gender prejudice, which can be seen in the lower expectations that are placed upon girls as compared to boys. On page 27, Jem tells Scout, "It's time you started being a girl and acting right." Later on, when Scout and Jem are talking about Aunt Alexander, Jem says to Scout, "She's trying to make you a lady. Can't you take up sewing or something?" Additionally, on page 127, as Scout chats to Calpurnia in the kitchen after realising that Jem is growing up and she has no one to play with, she observes that with what Calpurnia is doing and begins to think that there might be some skill involved in being a girl. She seemed glad to see me when I appeared in the kitchen, and by watching her I began to think that there was some skill involved in being a girl. It is clear from these references that general expectations in the Macon community was that the role of women was domestic activity, and that was the girls moved from childhood into adulthood they would learn skills such as sewing, cleaning and cooking, and that no formal education was only for boys. There was no expectation that girls would achieve anything other than domestic service. This is highlighted when Jem is speaking to Scout and says, "Imagine Auntie being proud of her great-granddaddy could read and write. Ladies pick funny things to be proud of." This shows that Jem thinks it's strange for a woman to be proud of a man that could read and write. In his eyes, all men could read and write because boys were allowed an education in the Macon community and girls were not. Harper Lee has Jem asking rhetorical questions in order to prompt the reader to answer the questions for themselves and to consider the prejudiced views he displays. There is a history of gender inequality in New South Wales, where women could not vote until 1902. Another example of gender inequality in Australian history was when women were having to leave their jobs when they got married, known as the marriage bar practice. Some women even kept their marriages secret so that they could remain in employment. This is a clear example of gender prejudice. From exploring gender prejudice in To Kill a Mockingbird, my eyes have been opened to the shocking reality of how people suffer of discrimination. I have also learned that people are often prejudiced because they simply follow the crowd and do what they have always done. In the Macon community in the 1930s, most of the people still had their mindsets that white people were superior to black people, following on from the history of slavery in the recent past. Jesus tells us to love our neighbour as he would love ourselves. This means not to discriminate against others for any reason, including skin colour or gender, but to in fact treat them the same way that they would love to be treated. This is what Atticus did, even though he didn't win the case. He spoke up and spoke out against racial prejudice. Thank you.